While they were still talking about this, Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, "Peace be with you." They were startled and frightened, thinking they saw a ghost. He said to them, "Why are you troubled? And why do doubts rise in your minds? Look at my hands and my feet. It is I myself. Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones, as you see I have." When he had said this, he showed them his hands and feet. And while they still did not believe it, because of joy and amazement, he asked them, "Do you have anything here to eat?" They gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and ate it in their presence.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Are you awake this morning?
Yes.
Yes, good. All right. This is a sermon about being awake. I remember the night that my youngest daughter Lydia was born very well. It was actually early morning. We were at my parents' house, who at the time lived in Clarence, and Mary had been extremely uncomfortable sleeping. So she was curled up on the couch, and I was sound asleep in bed. All of a sudden, she came and got me. "Are you awake? I think I'm in labor." Well, I wasn't awake before, but I am now. And I was awake for a long time that day. Lydia was actually born about noon later on. It was a great day. It was an exhausting day, more for Mary than for me. And even though she fell asleep after giving birth to Lydia, I guess it's hard work, I didn't feel...
Beat you up.
Oh, this is fun. I didn't feel all that tired until the evening came. But here's the real question. Have you ever been startled awake by something and you couldn't go back to sleep for some reason? I want you to think about that moment as we think about our passage. Because in our passage this morning, the disciples are startled out of the fog of depression and sadness. They're tired. They don't know what's going on here. It's a birth story of sorts. They were on the verge of becoming changed people, reborn. They would not be going back to who they were once they awakened to the reality of the resurrection of Jesus. And that's what Making Sense of the Resurrection is all about. This whole sermon series has been about making sense of the resurrection of Jesus. It's the birth of faith. We are changed people when we believe. Now, it might be a mystery to us, all this stuff. Like, why are we gathered in this room here? This is very strange. What is this thing called church? What is this religion called Christianity? You know, sometimes we take it so much for granted that we forget that there's a whole world out there that has no idea what's going on here. But the mystery clears up for everybody in the context of faith. At its very heart, the very heart of Christianity is personal belief, conviction. That's where the power lies, when you and I believe. And belief is a decision that we have to make. Just like when we decide on a career, or even when we decide on what to have for dinner, even if it's at the last minute. We all have choices we have to make, and one of those choices is about whether to believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So this morning, let's explore how the disciples came to make their choice. We're in the second of three parts of looking at chapter 24 in Luke. And I said that the author Luke frames Jesus' resurrection as a mystery, slowly revealing the clues until the big reveal at the end. Our passage this morning is relatively short, and it kind of echoes a similar story found in the Gospel of John. But as he did with the Emmaus Road story, you'll notice that Luke spices things up by sprinkling in some doubt. The disciples have trouble believing their own eyes. In the previous passage, Jesus disappears, remember, just as the two disciples in Emmaus came to believe that it was really him sitting with them. And they run back to Jerusalem and they begin to explain what has happened to them, and they have come to believe that Jesus really is alive. Now, we don't know what the discussion sounded like between the disciples in the upper room and these two from Emmaus. I would imagine, though, it sounded a lot like the discussion between the women who came back from the tomb when they found the tomb empty and the disciples in the upper room. Like, what are you talking about? What's going on? You're hallucinating. And that's when verse 36 breaks into the picture here. Take a look. While they were still talking about this, Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, "Peace be with you." They were startled and frightened, thinking that they had seen a ghost. Could it really be Jesus? And how could he just appear like that? That's very odd. The doors are locked. They didn't see them open. Jesus just kind of pops up. He must be a ghost, or maybe we're hallucinating. The disciples don't know what they're seeing. And Jesus knows from their startled expressions and their frightened looks that they're not quite sure what's going on. And so, in verse 38, he said to them, "Why are you troubled? And why do doubts rise in your minds?" Now, you might be wondering why the disciples would have been in doubt when Jesus is standing right there in front of them. Could they not accept reality? Didn't they understand the prophecy from the Old Testament? I mean, what's going on? What's their problem? Come on, disciples, wake up. The problem is that they're baffled. And when we're tired, when we're worried, I mean, think about it. We miss things that we should understand. Anyone who's ever edited a college paper, after pulling an all-nighter, you kind of finally get the paper done, and then you pull it up the next morning and you think, "Oh, I wonder how this sounds." And it doesn't make any sense at all sometimes. Tired, you're worried, you miss things. And they knew, like you and I know, that dead people, especially ones that have been dead for more than 48 hours, do not come back to life. Okay? They're not simpletons. There's no way the disciples could have made this story up. This was beyond their range of thinking. They all believe that Jesus is dead, that he's in the tomb, or that his body has somehow disappeared. But they do not think that he's alive. I mean, in some circles, the disciples are criticized for being simple minds. They're just peasants who don't understand what's really going on, and they just bought into their hallucinations and their fantasies. But take a look at this passage, and it clears up the misconception. They know they shouldn't believe what they are seeing. But how does the saying go? Seeing is believing. These disciples had been in a funk. They've been traumatized by Jesus' execution. They're depressed. They're scared of their future. They're wondering who's going to come to the door and arrest them and take them away. Most have been trapped in this upper room for a few days now. And as we know, as I've said before, there were not just 12 people in this upper room. This is a big place. There were probably about 200 people, men and women. So I want you to think about this for a second. Imagine that there's 200 people in here. And imagine that we've all been sitting here for about 3 days and we haven't really moved around much. How do you think it would be? Ugh. Right? A little smelly maybe, a little funky.
Yeah.
They're in this smelly, funky room. And so they initially don't believe what they see. They think they've been just up for too long. The lights are dim. What's going on? We must be hallucinating. But Jesus challenges them. Look at verse 39 with me. "Look at my hands and my feet. It is I myself. Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones, as you see that I have." When he had said this, he showed them his hands and his feet. And while they still did not believe it because of joy and amazement, he asked them, "Do you have anything to eat?" They gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it, and he ate it in their presence. I like how they're in this stinky room, and what do they have for him? Fish. Now, Jesus is all about clearing up their doubts. And Jesus is all about clearing up our doubts as well. Because I think it's natural to doubt. We have doubts. I mean, can't see God. And Jesus isn't just hanging around in the flesh. But the disciples are not so easily convinced as the guys from Emmaus were. But quickly enough, as our passage notes in verse 41, their doubts turn to joy and to amazement. They've gone from being in a haze to being amazed. See what I did there? Okay. Some of you are sleeping. Somehow Jesus is among them, standing there in the flesh. How it is that he could do that and still be in the flesh and not a ghost is a mystery. There's a lot of mysteries here, and that's okay. But what does Jesus finally do to convince them? He eats with them. Just as they had found comfort in the Last Supper before Jesus' execution, just as the Emmaus Road disciples recognized Jesus in the breaking of the bread, so now Jesus' disciples recognized him as being real in the flesh when he eats with them. Jesus still offers to clear up our doubts in our minds by offering us another meal. That's the sacrament of communion. Do you recognize Jesus in the breaking of the bread and the sharing of the cup? Is communion simply maybe just a ritual to you? You come up, you get your elements, you sit down. That was good. Or do you imagine yourself gathered with Jesus and the disciples around the communion table in the upper room, sharing a meal? Because that's what we're intended to do when we gather around the communion table. The act of communion itself can lead us to understanding. It can point us to faith. When we come to the table, it's actually a sign of our faith, believe it or not. No matter how much or how little that we think we might have, we come in faith. And by that same faith at the table, we receive the grace that we need to keep walking with Jesus each day. When we have communion together, I want to challenge you to be fully awake and alive as you come forward, to sweep out the cobwebs. Rise and shine, everybody. We're going to have communion. It's going to be great. Be awake in your faith. Be awake to your doubts. It's okay to doubt. Be awake to the presence of Jesus with us in the breaking of the bread and the sharing of the cup. Be awake to receive grace, the grace that we all need. Communion is Jesus' gift to each of us. I mean, think about it. It's important to realize that when Jesus appeared to his disciples, there was nothing that they could do for him anymore at that point. He had already defeated death, and what more could they do except believe? The same is true for us. We don't come up here as a favor to Jesus or to anyone else. We come up here to receive something from him. It may seem like it's just bread and juice, and it is just bread and juice. But the spiritual reality that happens to us in that moment is that we're receiving grace, we're receiving fellowship with one another and with Jesus as our Lord and our teacher and our friend. So once again, are you awake this morning? Yes. Okay, good. Some of you, at least. Are you awake to the reality of the resurrection? And I hope that you'll say this morning, well, I wasn't awake before, but I am now.